President Trump ramping up pressure on Iran, warning this could be the Islamic Republic's final chance to reach a deal as diplomatic talks continue.
History has taught us that the world's biggest crises don't always begin with explosions. Sometimes they begin with a warning that most people dismiss until it's too late. Today, President Donald Trump has delivered one of his strongest messages yet: reopen the Strait of Hormuz, or Iran could face severe consequences. At first glance, it sounds like another chapter in the long-running U.S.-Iran rivalry. But what if this isn't just another political headline? What if this warning is really about something far bigger than either country? Here's the first mystery. How can a narrow stretch of water, so small it barely stands out on a world map, hold enough strategic importance to influence global oil supplies, international shipping, financial markets, and military planning at the same time? That's the first question we'll answer. But it isn't the biggest one, because hidden behind the headlines is another question that almost nobody is asking. If the United States possesses one of the world's most powerful militaries, why can't it simply ignore the Strait of Hormuz? Why would any nation risk economic disruption or military escalation over a single waterway? And if diplomacy is still taking place behind closed doors, why are public warnings becoming even stronger? None of these questions has a simple answer, because this story isn't just about military power. It isn't just about oil, and it isn't just about the relationship between Washington and Tehran. This is a story about geography, strategy, economics, and the invisible calculations that world leaders make when every decision carries enormous consequences. Over the next hour, we'll trace how the Strait of Hormuz became one of the most strategically significant waterways on Earth, why it remains at the center of U.S.-Iran tensions, what both sides hope to gain or avoid, and what could happen if diplomacy fails. By the end of this documentary, one thing will become clear. The most important battle in this crisis may not be fought with missiles at all. It may be fought with decisions, and those decisions could shape events far beyond the Middle East. So before we examine today's warning, we have to understand how the world arrived at this moment, because this story didn't begin this week. It didn't begin this year. In many ways, it has been building for decades. Chapter 2, the waterway that holds the world hostage. Take a map of the Middle East, and you'll probably miss it. No towering mountains, no sprawling cities, no famous landmarks that attract millions of tourists. Just a narrow ribbon of water separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula. Yet this ordinary-looking passage has become one of the most strategically important places on Earth. This is the Strait of Hormuz. For thousands of years, these waters connected civilizations. Merchants sailed through them, carrying spices, silk, pearls, and precious metals long before oil transformed the region. Back then, whoever controlled these waters influenced trade. Today, the stakes are far higher. Instead of wooden sailing ships, massive oil tankers, liquefied natural gas carriers, and commercial vessels pass through every day. They carry energy supplies that power factories, fuel aircraft, keep hospitals running, and support economies across Asia, Europe, and beyond. That's why events in this narrow passage can affect people living thousands of kilometers away. Not because they are close to the strait, but because they depend directly or indirectly on what moves through it. Now look closer. The Strait of Hormuz isn't an open ocean where ships can simply spread out. Its navigable shipping lanes are limited and carefully managed to reduce the risk of collisions. That means commercial traffic follows predictable routes. Predictability is efficient. But in times of crisis, it also creates vulnerability. If shipping slows, insurance costs can rise, freight rates can increase, energy markets can react. Sometimes markets move not because a route has actually closed, but because traders fear it might. In geopolitics, expectations alone can have real economic effects. This explains why the strait appears so often in international headlines. When tensions rise between Iran and the United States, or between Iran and regional rivals, the conversation almost always returns to the same question: what happens to the Strait of Hormuz? Not because closing it would be simple, and not because anyone can control it without consequences, but because uncertainty itself carries weight. A single statement from a political leader, a naval incident, a report of increased military activity. Any of these can trigger concern far beyond the Middle East. So why is this waterway such a recurring source of tension? Part of the answer lies in geography. Iran's coastline overlooks much of the northern side of the strait. Across the water sit several Gulf states whose economies also depend on these shipping lanes. The United States, while not bordering the strait, has long maintained a naval presence in the broader region and has repeatedly stated that freedom of navigation is a core interest. Those overlapping interests create a complicated reality. Every country has different priorities. Every public statement is heard by multiple audiences, and every move is interpreted through the lens of decades of history. That history matters, because the current dispute did not appear overnight. It grew through years of sanctions, negotiations, military incidents, regional rivalries, and disagreements over Iran's nuclear program. Each episode added another layer of mistrust. Each crisis made the next one harder to resolve, which brings us back to today. When President Trump warned that Iran must reopen the strait or face severe consequences, the message was understood in very different ways. Some viewed it as a warning intended to deter interference with international shipping. Others saw it as pressure designed to strengthen the U.S. position in ongoing diplomacy. Iran, for its part, has often argued that external pressure and sanctions are central to the broader dispute and has insisted that its own security concerns cannot be ignored. Understanding both perspectives doesn't mean agreeing with either. It means recognizing why resolving this crisis has proven so difficult. Here's the paradox. Everyone benefits when the strait remains open. Disruption threatens exporters, importers, consumers, and regional stability. Yet periods of heightened tension repeatedly bring the world back to the same point of uncertainty. Why? Because the strait is not only a shipping route, it has become a symbol of leverage, a place where military power, economic pressure, and diplomacy intersect. And that raises an even bigger question. If everyone understands the costs of escalation, why do leaders continue issuing warnings that could increase those risks? Is it because they genuinely expect conflict, or because strong public language is sometimes used to influence negotiations happening behind closed doors? The answer isn't straightforward, and it takes us into the next chapter. Because before we can understand today's warning, we need to understand the long and complicated relationship between Washington and Tehran. A relationship shaped by revolution, sanctions, negotiations, confrontation, and repeated attempts to avoid a conflict that neither side says it wants, but neither side has found easy to escape. Chapter 3. From Partners to Rivals. Every conflict has a beginning, but the beginning isn't always where people think it is. When most people hear about tensions between the United States and Iran, they imagine a rivalry that has always existed. It hasn't. In fact, there was a time when the two countries were close strategic partners. To understand today's crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, we have to travel back nearly a century, because the decisions made decades ago still echo through every negotiation, every warning, and every military deployment we see today. A different Middle East. Before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Iran was one of Washington's most important allies in the region. The government of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi maintained close political, economic, and military ties with the United States. American companies invested in Iran. Military cooperation expanded. Iran purchased advanced Western equipment. For Washington, Iran was viewed as a pillar of regional stability during the Cold War. But beneath the surface, not everyone in Iran believed that partnerships served the country's interests. Many criticized the Shah's rule, arguing that political freedoms were limited and that foreign influence had become too strong. Those frustrations continued to grow, and eventually, they exploded. The revolution that changed everything. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution transformed the country. The monarchy collapsed. A new Islamic republic emerged under Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. It wasn't simply a change of government. It was a complete shift in Iran's domestic politics and foreign policy. Relations with Washington deteriorated rapidly. Then came the event that permanently reshaped the relationship. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran was seized, and dozens of American diplomats were held hostage for more than a year. The crisis dominated global headlines. Trust collapsed. Diplomatic relations were severed. And from that moment forward, the relationship entered an entirely new era, one marked not by partnership, but by suspicion, decades of pressure. The years that followed brought sanctions, political disputes, regional conflicts, and periods of military tension. At times, diplomacy appeared possible. At other moments, confrontation dominated the headlines. Neither side completely abandoned dialogue, but neither side managed to rebuild lasting trust. Every new crisis reinforced old grievances. Every failed negotiation made the next one more difficult. Over time, a pattern emerged. Escalation, negotiation, temporary progress, renewed tension. Then the cycle would begin again. The nuclear question. One of the most significant issues became Iran's nuclear program. Iran has long maintained that its nuclear activities are intended for peaceful purposes, including energy production and scientific research. The United States and several other countries have expressed concern that the program could potentially be used to develop nuclear weapons. Those competing positions became the center of years of negotiations. Agreements were reached, some restrictions were implemented, some sanctions were eased. But disagreements over compliance, verification, and future commitments continued. The result was a diplomatic process that achieved important milestones while leaving fundamental disputes unresolved. A region filled with pressure points. The U.S.-Iran relationship is not shaped by one issue alone. It intersects with broader regional conflicts, maritime security, economic sanctions, missile programs, and the interests of neighboring countries. That is why events in one part of the Middle East often influence developments somewhere else. A naval incident, a missile launch, a new sanctions package, a diplomatic breakthrough. Each can alter the atmosphere almost immediately. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of many of those calculations because it connects security concerns with global trade. Today's warning in historical context. When President Trump warned that Iran could face severe consequences if the Strait of Hormuz was not reopened, the statement was interpreted through this long history. Supporters viewed it as a message of deterrence, an effort to protect international shipping and prevent further disruption. Critics argued that strong public warnings can complicate delicate negotiations. At the same time, reports indicated that diplomatic contacts had not completely stopped. That combination, firm rhetoric alongside ongoing talks, is not new. It reflects a pattern seen repeatedly over the past several decades. Public pressure, private diplomacy, strategic signaling, and constant efforts to avoid miscalculation. But history doesn't decide the future. History explains why trust is limited. It explains why every statement is carefully analyzed. It explains why the Strait of Hormuz attracts so much attention. But history alone cannot tell us what happens next. Because today's crisis depends not only on the past, it depends on the choices being made right now. Military planners are evaluating risks. Diplomats are searching for common ground. Markets are reacting to every headline. And ordinary people around the world are watching fuel prices, shipping costs, and international news with growing concern. The next chapter is where strategy replaces history. Because to understand why the Strait of Hormuz remains so important, we need to look beyond politics and into the military calculations that shape every move. Only then can we answer the question that has been hanging over this documentary since the very beginning. If both sides understand how costly a wider conflict would be, why does the risk of escalation remain so high? Chapter 4, the military chessboard. If geography gave the Strait of Hormuz its importance, military strategy turned it into one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Every nation studies maps, but military planners don't just see coastlines, they see opportunities and vulnerabilities. To the average person, the Strait of Hormuz is simply a narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman. To generals, it is a battlefield that could decide the outcome of a regional crisis before the first major battle is even fought. Because in modern warfare, controlling territory is important, but controlling movement can be even more powerful. Imagine you're commanding a massive oil tanker. Your cargo is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Your destination is thousands of kilometers away. There is only one practical route, and every radar screen around you is filled with military vessels, warships, patrol boats, surveillance aircraft, reconnaissance drones, Everyone is watching everyone else. One mistake, one misunderstanding, one wrong decision, and suddenly, the entire world is watching your ship. This isn't fiction. It's the reality of operating in one of the world's most strategically sensitive waterways. For decades, the United States has maintained a significant naval presence in the broader region. Its stated objective has been to help protect international shipping routes, reassure regional partners, and deter attacks on commercial vessels. That presence has included aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, logistics ships, surveillance aircraft, and other assets depending on the situation. These forces are designed to respond quickly if shipping is threatened, but having powerful forces nearby doesn't eliminate risk, because the challenge isn't only military capability, it's decision-making under pressure. On the other side, Iran has developed a very different approach. Rather than trying to match the United States ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft, Iran has focused on strategies designed to complicate an opponent's operations in and around the Gulf. Fast attack craft, coastal missile systems, naval mines, drones, missile forces, layer by layer. These capabilities are intended to make any military operation in the area more complex and more costly. Whether or not they would succeed in a major conflict is debated by analysts. But their existence shapes planning on all sides, and that's what makes this region so dangerous. Neither side needs to seek a full-scale war for tensions to rise. A misunderstanding at sea, a disputed incident, or conflicting interpretations of the same event could quickly change the situation. That's why communication channels and diplomacy often continue even during periods of intense public rhetoric. Now return to today's headlines. President Trump's warning about reopening the Strait of Hormuz wasn't made in isolation. It came against the backdrop of this complex military environment. Every statement is analyzed. Every movement is watched. Every deployment sends a message. Sometimes those messages are intended to reassure allies, sometimes to deter adversaries, and sometimes to strengthen a negotiating position without firing a single shot. But here's the question that changes everything. If both sides possess significant military capabilities, why hasn't this long-running confrontation turned into a sustained full-scale war? Is restraint driven by military balance, economic consequences, international pressure, or something far more complicated? The answer lies beyond the battlefield. Because in this crisis, the world's most powerful weapon may not be a missile. It may be the global economy. And that's exactly where our story goes next. Chapter 5. The day the world runs out of options. Wars don't only destroy cities. Sometimes, they shake the entire global economy before the first major battle even begins. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning. You unlock your phone. Every major news network is broadcasting the same headline. Commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has been severely disrupted. Within minutes, oil traders begin reacting. Shipping companies reassess routes. Governments call emergency meetings. Financial markets become increasingly volatile, not because the world has run out of oil overnight, but because uncertainty spreads faster than tankers ever could. This is why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. It is not just a regional waterway, it is one of the world's most important energy corridors. When investors believe supplies could be interrupted, markets often respond immediately, even before the full facts are known. That is the power of expectation. In global finance, fear itself can move prices. Now think beyond gasoline. Modern economies depend on energy at almost every stage. Factories, cargo ships, airlines, agriculture, hospitals, construction, data centers. If transportation becomes more expensive, the cost of moving goods can rise. And when transportation costs increase, businesses often face difficult choices. Absorb the losses, or pass those costs on to consumers. That is why governments far from the Middle East also watch developments in the Strait of Hormuz. A crisis there can influence decisions in capitals across Asia, Europe, and beyond. Energy security is no longer just a regional issue. It is a global one. But here's something even more interesting. The United States is not the only country with a major stake in keeping these waters open. Many nations rely on stable shipping lanes for their own economic security. That is one reason why freedom of navigation has become a recurring theme in international diplomacy. Because when commerce slows, everyone feels the pressure. Even countries that are not directly involved in the dispute. Now return to today's confrontation. President Trump's warning focused attention on reopening the strait. Supporters argued that uninterrupted maritime trade is essential. Iran, meanwhile, has consistently argued that its own security concerns and the effects of sanctions cannot be separated from discussions about regional stability. Those competing priorities help explain why negotiations have proven so difficult. Each side believes its concerns are fundamental, and neither wants to appear to compromise under pressure. History shows that strong public rhetoric and private diplomacy often happen at the same time. Leaders speak to multiple audiences, their own citizens, their allies, their rivals, financial markets. Sometimes a statement is meant to deter. Sometimes it is meant to reassure. Sometimes it is part of a broader negotiating strategy. Understanding which is rarely simple. So what happens next? That depends on decisions that may never be fully visible to the public. Diplomats continue talking, military planners continue preparing, markets continue reacting, and every new headline is examined for clues about what comes next. Because in crises like this, events can change quickly. But there is one final mystery we haven't answered. Throughout this documentary, one question has remained in the background. If a wider conflict would carry enormous military, economic, and political costs, why do both sides continue pushing so close to the edge? Is it calculated deterrence, political signaling, or has the margin for error become dangerously small? The answer brings together everything we've explored, from geography and history to strategy and economics. And it leads us to the final chapter. The chapter where all the open loops come together. Part 6, the final chapter, the decision that could shape the region's future. In every great geopolitical crisis, there comes a moment when the world asks one question. What happens next? Not next year, not next month, but tomorrow. Because tomorrow is where history begins. Throughout this documentary, we've followed a chain of events that started with a warning. A warning from President Donald Trump that Iran must reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face severe consequences. At first, it sounded like another headline in a region that has witnessed decades of tension. But as we've uncovered layer after layer, we discovered something much bigger. This was never just about one statement. It was never just about one waterway. And it was never just about two countries. Remember the very first question we asked? How can one narrow stretch of water become so important that the entire world pays attention? Now you know the answer, because the Strait of Hormuz is where geography meets economics, where diplomacy meets military strategy, where regional politics can have global consequences. Its importance doesn't come from its size. It comes from what passes through it, and from what could happen if that movement is disrupted. Now let's answer our second mystery. If both sides understand the cost of a wider conflict, why do tensions keep returning? The answer isn't simple. Neither the United States nor Iran operates in a vacuum. Each government must consider national security, regional alliances, domestic politics, economic pressures, and international diplomacy. Public statements often serve multiple purposes at once. They can reassure allies, deter opponents, influence negotiations, or communicate resolve. That doesn't mean conflict is inevitable. But it does explain why rhetoric can become so intense even while diplomatic contacts continue. And that leads to the biggest open loop of all. Is war unavoidable? The honest answer is that no one can say with certainty. History shows that crises have sometimes escalated unexpectedly. History also shows that periods of intense tension have often been followed by negotiations that reduce the immediate risk. The future depends on decisions that have not yet been made, by leaders, by diplomats, by military commanders, and by events that can change rapidly. Perhaps the most important lesson from this story is that military power alone does not determine outcomes. Economic stability matters. Diplomatic communication matters. Accurate information matters. And avoiding miscalculation matters. Because in an interconnected world, decisions made in one region can affect people far beyond it. Fuel prices, shipping, trade, financial markets. Even everyday consumers can feel the effects of uncertainty. So when you see headlines about the Strait of Hormuz, Don't think of it as just another place on a map. Think of it as one of the world's key strategic crossroads, a place where commerce, security, and diplomacy intersect. A place where every statement is scrutinized, every movement is observed, and every decision carries weight. Today's warning may become the beginning of renewed diplomacy, or it may become another chapter in a long history of confrontation. At this moment, the outcome remains uncertain. What is certain is this: the Strait of Hormuz will continue to be one of the most closely watched waterways on Earth, because as long as it remains central to global trade and regional security, the world will keep watching, waiting, and hoping that the next major headline is about dialogue, rather than conflict. History is often written by battles, but sometimes history is written by the battles that never happen. The question now is, which kind of history will this crisis become? Thank you for watching.